The wind moved slowly across the wide, empty land, carrying dust and the sound of rustling grass. The sun had not yet climbed high, but the Texas sky was already glowing orange and gold. A small wooden cabin stood in the middle of this endless plain, lonely, but full of life. Inside it lived a young woman named Mary Parker with her husband and their baby boy. They had come west with dreams of starting a new life, of owning land, raising crops, and building something that would last. Life on the frontier was not easy. Every day brought a new kind of struggle. The summers were too hot, the winters too cruel, and help was always far away. But Mary had learned to be strong. She rose with the sun, cooked over a small fire, washed clothes by hand, and sang to her baby while her husband worked in the fields. It was a hard life, but when she looked at her child's face, she felt that all the effort was worth it. That little smile was her world. The baby was just learning to crawl. He would reach for everything, even the rough wooden floor or the hem of her dress, and Mary would laugh, scooping him up in her arms. She had grown used to the quiet sounds of their days, the cry of her baby, the call of birds, the creak of the old cabin in the wind. The world outside was wild, but inside that small home she felt safe. Every evening when her husband came back from working the land, they would sit on the porch and watch the sunset together. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that made their tiny home feel rich. Sometimes he would talk about the future, how they would plant more crops next season, how their son would grow up running through these open fields. Mary would smile and listen, feeling proud and hopeful. Still, deep inside, she carried a quiet fear, one that all settlers knew too well. The frontier was unpredictable. There were stories whispered by travelers and trapper about raids, wild animals, and people disappearing without a trace. But Mary tried not to let such stories haunt her. She focused on what she could see and touch: her baby's heartbeat, her husband's steady voice, the smell of fresh bread baking in the pan. That morning, she woke up before sunrise. The world outside was still half asleep, wrapped in mist. She stirred the fire and began preparing breakfast. Her husband was already outside, checking on the horses. She could hear the faint sound of hooves, the creak of wood, and the soft cry of her baby waking up. She smiled and went to him, lifting him gently, pressing her cheek against his soft hair. "Good morning, my little man," she whispered, rocking him slowly. The cabin felt warm with the sound of her humming. For a moment, everything was calm, the kind of peace that makes a person forget the world's dangers. She didn't know that life was about to change forever. As she stepped outside to hang the washing, she looked across the horizon. The land stretched endlessly, golden under the morning sun. There was beauty in its emptiness, but also something haunting, a silence that felt too deep. She had felt it before, that strange stillness that seemed to warn her of something she couldn't name. But then her baby giggled and the thought disappeared like smoke. Her husband called from the field, asking for water. She poured some into a jug and carried it toward him. The grass brushed against her dress as she walked. Everything looked ordinary: the cabin, the fence, the animals grazing nearby. She had no reason to think this day would be any different. If she had looked a little further, she might have seen the faint shadow of movement on the far ridge, riders in the distance, hidden by the sunlight. But Mary was thinking only of her baby, now playing with a small wooden toy her husband had carved. She smiled, unaware that the world she knew was about to break apart in ways she could never imagine. For now, there was only the calm of a new morning, the sound of her baby's laughter, the smell of bread baking, and the soft hum of life on the frontier. It was a moment frozen in time, the last quiet morning before everything changed. The morning sun had risen higher now, spreading light across the plains. The air was still and warm, and the smell of earth drifted gently through the breeze. Mary could hear the familiar sounds of her husband working, the thud of the shovel, the creak of the fence gate, the low call to the horses. It was the kind of morning that made her believe everything was fine, that the world outside their small cabin was calm and kind. Inside, her baby was playing with a small wooden cup, laughing as it rolled across the floor. Mary smiled as she watched him, feeling grateful for the little joys that made up their simple life. She hummed softly while stirring a pot over the fire, thinking about the day ahead. Washing clothes, baking bread, maybe mending a shirt or two. The quiet rhythm of her days was something she had learned to love. But that morning something felt slightly different. The birds that usually sang near the cabin were silent. The air carried a strange stillness, and not peaceful, but heavy. Mary noticed it while stepping outside to check the drying clothes. The sky was bright, yet there was a faint tension in the wind that made her stop and listen. Her husband was still near the fence, but now he seemed uneasy too. He turned his head quickly, scanning the open land. Mary called out to ask if something was wrong, but he just shook his head, maybe not wanting to worry her. Still, his face said otherwise. He kept glancing toward the far hills as if trying to understand what his instincts were whispering. Mary felt her heart beat a little faster. She went back inside and picked up her baby, holding him close. He was calm, resting his tiny hand on her shoulder. She stood by the small window, staring out at the endless land that surrounded them. The silence was strange, so quiet that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then came a faint sound, so distant she thought she imagined it. A dull rhythm, like thunder far away. She frowned and looked again. The horizon shimmered with heat, but something was moving out there, small at first, then growing clearer. Shapes, dark, fast, and coming closer. Her husband had seen it too. He shouted something to her, his voice sharp and urgent, breaking the stillness. She didn't fully understand, but fear rushed through her. She clutched her baby tighter and stepped back. Her husband ran toward the cabin, his boots hitting the dry ground hard. "Stay inside," he called out. His tone wasn't angry, and it was frightened, the kind of fear that said danger was real. Mary stood frozen for a moment, trying to listen. The sound grew louder now, a mix of hooves pounding the earth and distant shouts she couldn't make out. She didn't know who it was or why they were coming, but she knew enough to be afraid. Out here, on the open frontier, no one ever arrived without reason. Her husband's voice came again, shouting something she couldn't hear clearly. Then there was chaos and the sound of horses, dust rising, movement everywhere. Mary held her baby close, whispering to him to stay quiet, though he couldn't understand. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed into the corner of the cabin, wishing the walls were stronger, wishing this was just a bad dream. The air filled with the thunder of hooves and voices. Everything was happening too fast to make sense of. She could only think of her baby, his warmth against her chest, his soft breathing, his small fingers clutching her dress, and then, suddenly silence again, a heavy, unnatural quiet after the storm of noise. The dust outside was still floating in the sunlight, and Mary could only hear the faint crackle of the fire inside. Her hands were trembling as she rocked her baby, trying to calm herself as much as him. She didn't know what had happened to her husband, or what was waiting outside the door. Her world had changed in an instant. The safe, ordinary life she knew just hours ago was gone. As she looked around the cabin, the chairs, the table, the little blanket her baby slept on, everything seemed to fade into unreality. It was still her home, but it didn't feel like it anymore. It felt like the walls were holding their breath, like the whole world had paused, waiting for what would come next. Mary took a deep breath and whispered softly to her baby, "It's going to be all right," even though she didn't know if it would be. She only knew one thing for certain. The land outside her window no longer felt safe. What had begun as an ordinary morning had turned into something she could not yet understand. The wind that once carried peace now carried fear, and her heart told her that nothing would ever be the same again. Mary sat in the corner of the small cabin, holding her baby close to her chest. Her heart was still beating fast. The silence outside was strange, not peaceful anymore, but heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. She could hear only the soft crackle of the fire and the tiny sounds her baby made while shifting in her arms. Every few seconds she looked toward the door, expecting her husband to walk in and tell her everything was fine. But he didn't. Time seemed to slow down. Minutes felt like hours. She wanted to believe that it was all just a misunderstanding. Maybe some travelers passing by, maybe a herd of animals. But deep inside she knew something had changed. The air outside didn't feel the same anymore. It carried a weight of fear she couldn't explain. Then came the sound of voices, not clear but distant and low. Mary froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't recognize the language, but she could feel the tone. Sharp, commanding, and full of tension. She gently pressed her baby's head against her shoulder and whispered softly, "Shh, my love, stay quiet." Her baby didn't cry, almost as if he too could sense her fear. The door opened slowly, and bright light filled the dark cabin. Mary squinted. covering her baby's eyes from the sudden glare. A tall figure stood there, and not one she knew. His expression wasn't angry but unreadable, his eyes scanning the room carefully. Behind him, others waited, watching silently. Mary's whole body went cold. She didn't move, didn't speak, just held her child tightly, hoping someone would understand she meant no harm. The man took a slow step forward, his eyes falling on the baby. For a moment, everything stopped. The sound of the wind outside disappeared, and all that remained was that quiet, strange stare between two people who lived in completely different worlds. Mary didn't understand what was happening, but the man didn't raise his hand or his voice. He simply looked, not at her, but at the child in her arms. There was something softer in his eyes now, almost like confusion. He said something to the others in his own language, and they stepped back a little. The tension in the air lessened just slightly. Mary sat still, afraid to move or speak. She didn't know what to say or do. But when the man pointed toward the door, she understood. They wanted her to come with them. She didn't resist. She couldn't. She knew that whatever was waiting outside was her only chance to stay alive and protect her baby. With trembling hands, she wrapped the small blanket around her child and stood up. The man waited, not rushing her. When she finally stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face and she saw the open land stretch endlessly in every direction. The sky looked the same as it always had, but her world had completely changed. The group surrounded her, yet they didn't shout or act cruelly. They simply began to move, leading her away from the cabin, away from the life she had known. She looked back once. The small wooden house stood quietly against the vast horizon, smoke still rising from its chimney. It looked peaceful, almost unreal, like a dream fading from her memory. Her baby whimpered softly and she gently rocked him, whispering, "It's okay, my darling. I'm here." She didn't know where they were going, but she knew she had to keep her baby safe no matter what. That thought gave her the strength to keep walking. The journey across the plains felt endless. The heat pressed down on her and her feet ached, but she didn't complain. The men around her spoke among themselves, sometimes glancing at her with curiosity more than anger. They seemed surprised by how calm she was, but inside she was anything but calm. Her thoughts were racing, her heart torn between fear and hope. As the sun began to set, the land turned golden and red. They finally stopped near a small camp. There were fires burning, tents set up, and the smell of smoke in the air. She was guided to sit near one of the fires. No one heard her. They gave her a small piece of bread and water. She took it quietly, first feeding her baby, then herself. That night, as the stars filled the sky, Mary sat awake, staring into the fire. The faces around her were strangers, but she noticed something unexpected, not anger, but a sense of order. They were a people living by their own rules, their own way of life. She didn't understand it yet, but she felt something shift inside her, a strange sense that this wasn't just about fear anymore. Somehow, she knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test her strength in ways she had never imagined. The night passed slowly, and the cold air of the plains wrapped around Mary like a thin blanket. She held her baby close, keeping him warm against her chest. The stars above looked endless, thousands of tiny lights across the dark sky. For the first time in her life, she felt truly small, surrounded by land that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. When morning came, the camp began to wake. People moved quietly, tending to fires and preparing to travel again. The air smelled of smoke and earth. Mary watched them closely. These were people who knew how to live with the land, their movements calm, steady, and sure. She didn't understand their language, but she could sense the rhythm of their life. There was no chaos, only routine. One of the women, older and kind-faced, noticed Mary sitting with her baby. She came closer, carrying a small wooden bowl of food and a cup of water. Without saying anything, she placed them down gently beside her and gave a small nod before walking away. Mary looked at her, surprised. It wasn't much, but it felt like kindness, a sign that not everyone around her saw her as an enemy. Her baby cried softly, hungry again. Mary lifted him and began to feed him quietly. As she did, a shadow appeared nearby. It was the tall man from before, the one who had first seen her in the cabin. His presence was strong yet calm. He said a few words to the others and they fell silent. Then he turned his eyes toward Mary. For a moment they just looked at each other. She didn't know what he was thinking, and he couldn't understand her words, but something passed between them. Something wordless but deep. He wasn't looking at her with anger. His expression was thoughtful, almost gentle, as if he was trying to understand who she was and what kind of woman would walk across the plains holding a child so close. Mary didn't move. Her baby's soft breathing was the only sound between them. The man's gaze fell on the child, and a strange calmness crossed his face. It was as if he saw something that reminded him of another time, another place. After a moment, he spoke again, saying something to the others. His tone was firm but not harsh. One of the younger men brought her a small piece of cloth and a bit of food. The leader nodded toward her and then pointed at the campfire, as if telling her to stay close and safe. She didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway. Somehow she knew he had just given an order to protect her. As the day went on, Mary began to notice little things. How the group worked together. How the older ones guided the younger ones. How laughter sometimes echoed across the camp. Life here was hard, but it was built on unity and respect. Even though she was a stranger, she could sense that these people had their own kind of strength, different from what she had known, but real all the same. When evening came, the leader returned to the camp after being away most of the day. The others greeted him with quiet respect. He carried himself with the calmness of someone used to command, not through fear but through wisdom. As he passed by Mary again, he paused. His eyes met hers once more, and then his gaze fell on the baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. In that moment, something changed. He didn't say a word, but his face softened. Perhaps he saw not an outsider anymore, but a mother. Just a woman trying to protect her child. The same way any mother in his tribe would. That night, when the fire burned low and the camp grew quiet, Mary thought about that look. It stayed with her. She realized that behind all the fear and confusion, there was something unexpected here, a small spark of understanding. The next morning, as she woke, she found a small bundle near her tent, a soft piece of cloth and a few berries wrapped inside. She looked around, but no one was near. Still, she knew who it had come from. The gesture was silent, but it spoke more than words ever could. As she fed her baby again, she felt something shift inside her. The fear that had held her heart so tightly began to loosen just a little. She was still far from home, still surrounded by strangers, but she wasn't completely alone anymore. She didn't know why this leader had chosen to show kindness, or what it meant for her future. But for the first time since everything had changed, she felt a small, fragile hope, the kind that grows quietly, even in the middle of uncertainty. Days turned into weeks, and Mary slowly began to adjust to her new life in the camp. Every morning, the sun rose over the wide plains, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The people around her moved with purpose, tending to fires, caring for horses, preparing food. It was a different world from everything she had known, but she was learning to move within it quietly, carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. Her baby had grown stronger. He smiled more now, even laughed sometimes when one of the children came near and made funny faces at him. Those small moments kept her heart alive. They reminded her that love could survive anywhere, even in the middle of fear and loss. But not every day was peaceful. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when her thoughts turned to what she had lost, her home, her husband, the life she had built with her own hands. At night, when the camp grew quiet and only the crackle of the fire broke the silence, tears would sometimes fall without her meaning to cry. She missed the sound of her husband's voice, the safety of her own home, and the feeling of belonging. The leader, the same man who had first shown her mercy, would sometimes pass by her tent at night. He never said a word, but Mary could sense that he knew. Perhaps he understood the loneliness that came with loss. He carried himself like someone who had known sorrow too, though he never showed it. One evening, as the sun began to sink behind the hills, the air grew heavy with the coming of rain. The wind moved through the grass, whispering softly. Mary sat near the fire holding her baby close when the leader approached again. This time he didn't just glance and walk away. He stopped a few steps from her and spoke, slowly, carefully, as if choosing his words with care. She couldn't understand his language fully, but his tone wasn't sharp. His voice was calm, almost gentle. He pointed toward the horizon and then toward her child, saying a few short phrases that she couldn't quite catch. Still, she understood enough. He was telling her that the world was changing, that safety was fragile, and that she must stay strong for her child. Mary nodded silently, her eyes meeting his. For a moment there was no fear between them, only a quiet respect. Two human beings, both shaped by loss, both trying to protect what mattered most. But that night, as the rain began to fall, her heart grew heavy again. The memories came back, her husband's laughter, the small cabin, the life that had once seemed so simple and safe. She tried to push the images away, but they clung to her like the cold. She whispered to herself, "I can't do this anymore." Though she knew she had no choice but to keep going. Her baby stirred, sensing her sadness. She kissed his forehead, whispering softly, "It's going to be all right." The words were shaky, but speaking them out loud made them feel a little more real. The next morning, when the rain had stopped, she stepped outside to see the leader standing near the horses. He looked up as she approached, and for the first time he gave a faint smile. Not one of happiness, but of understanding. It was the kind of smile that told her he knew what it felt like to lose something you can never get back. In that moment, something inside her shifted. She realized that even though she was far from her old life, she still had a reason to keep moving forward. Her child needed her, and somehow she needed to believe that there was still goodness in the world, even in the most unexpected places. That day, the camp prepared to move again. As they packed their things, Mary looked around at the people, the children laughing, the women working together, the leader watching over them quietly. She saw a kind of strength in them that she hadn't understood before. It wasn't just power or control. It was unity, the will to survive, to care for one another even when life was uncertain. As the group began to travel again, Mary walked among them, holding her baby close. The land stretched before her, wide and endless, but it no longer felt as frightening as before. Somewhere deep inside, she had found a small piece of courage. She didn't know where this journey would lead or what her future would look like, but for the first time since that terrible morning when everything changed, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. It was quiet, fragile hope, but it was there. And as the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the open land, Mary took a deep breath and kept walking forward, believing that somehow, kindness could grow even in the hardest places. The sun rose over the open plains, painting the land in shades of gold and soft orange. The camp had begun to move early, long before the heat of the day could set in. Mary walked quietly with the others, her baby wrapped close to her chest. Each step was slow, steady, and filled with a quiet determination. She had learned to walk without complaint, to keep her head down and her heart focused on one thing, keeping her child safe. The days were long, but there was a strange rhythm to them now. She woke with the first light, helped where she could, and cared for her baby through the day. Sometimes one of the women from the group would hand her water or share a piece of food without speaking. Those small acts of kindness meant more than words ever could. Mary began to notice how the leader watched over everyone, not just her, but his whole people. He carried himself with quiet strength, and when he spoke, the others listened. There was something about him that reminded her of her husband. The same calm way of leading, the same sense of responsibility. She didn't know his name, but she could feel that his people trusted him deeply. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned red, Mary sat by the fire with her baby sleeping beside her. The leader approached slowly and sat a few steps away. The crackling firelight flickered across his face. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was peaceful, like two people sitting in quiet understanding. After a moment, he picked up a small branch and began drawing in the dirt, simple shapes, maybe trying to explain something. He pointed to the stars, then to the horizon, then made a motion like the rising sun. Mary watched, unsure what he meant, but she smiled politely. He looked at her for a long moment, then pointed at her baby and made a gesture toward his heart, as if to say, "Protect what you love." Mary nodded softly. She didn't need to know the exact words to understand the meaning. It was something universal, the love of a parent, the promise to keep life safe even in the hardest times. As the days went on, Mary and the leader's paths crossed more often. Sometimes he would bring food or water to where she sat. Other times he would just stop and make sure she and the baby were well. He never spoke much, but his actions spoke for him. The people in the camp seemed to notice too. No one questioned his kindness. They simply accepted it, the same way they accepted the rising of the sun each morning. One afternoon, a sudden storm rolled across the plains. The sky turned dark and strong winds swept through the camp. People hurried to secure their things. Mary tried to keep her baby dry, but the rain came fast. She struggled with a piece of cloth when the leader appeared, helping her build a small cover from branches and hides. He didn't say a word, just worked quietly beside her until they were safe from the rain. When the storm passed, the air smelled fresh and clean. The leader stood, nodded once, and walked away. Mary looked down at her sleeping child and felt a warmth in her heart. She realized that kindness could exist even in the most unexpected places, even between two people who came from completely different worlds. That night, as the stars returned to the sky, she thought about everything that had happened. She remembered the fear she had felt in the beginning, the hopelessness that had almost broken her spirit. But now she felt something different. The fear was still there, but it was smaller. In its place was something stronger. Courage. She didn't know what the future held. Maybe one day she would go home. Maybe she never would. But for now, she knew she had found a strange kind of peace in this new world. The people around her had shown her respect, and the leader's quiet compassion had reminded her that not all hearts were cold, even in times of hardship. As she looked at her baby's peaceful face, she whispered softly, "We're going to be all right." The words were gentle but sure. The fire crackled beside her, and a soft wind moved through the grass. Above, the stars shimmered like silver dust, endless and calm, and somewhere deep inside, Mary felt a truth she hadn't known before, that humanity could live in the smallest gestures, in silent kindness and in the strength to keep believing when the world felt uncertain. That night, for the first time since she had been taken from her home, Mary fell asleep not in fear but in quiet gratitude. The days were growing warmer, and the open plains were changing color. The grass waved gently in the wind, and the sky stretched wide and endless. By now, Mary had been with the camp long enough to understand the rhythm of their life. Every morning began the same way, with smoke rising from the fires, soft voices, and the smell of cooked grain. She had become part of the quiet routine. Though she still felt like a stranger, she was no longer treated like one. The people around her had accepted her presence, perhaps because of her gentle nature, or maybe because of her baby's laughter, which brought smiles even on hard days. Her child had become a small light in the camp. Everyone, from the children to the elders, noticed him. Some even brought him little gifts, smooth stones, feathers, or tiny woven charms. Mary's fear had slowly faded into something else, a strange mix of calmness and longing. She often wondered what would happen to her, whether she would ever return home. But more and more she found herself thinking less about the past and more about surviving each day with grace. One morning, a messenger arrived at the camp. He spoke urgently with the leader, who listened quietly. Mary couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the change in the air. The camp became restless. People began packing quickly, and the leader's expression grew serious. Something important was happening. Later that day, the leader came to her tent. He stood a few steps away, his expression steady but kind. He pointed toward the distant hills and then to her. It took her a moment, but she understood. They were going somewhere new. She didn't know where, but there was something different in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. The journey began at sunrise. The group moved across the land like a river, slow, silent, and unbroken. Mary walked with her baby close to her chest, following the leader's steady pace. The path was long, but she didn't complain. The land around them was beautiful in its own way, wild, open, and full of life. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before: the sound of birds calling from far away, the shimmer of heat on the horizon, the feeling of the earth beneath her feet. By evening, they reached a small valley with a stream running through it. The camp settled there, and for the first time in many days, the mood felt lighter. The leader spoke with some of the others, then turned toward Mary. He gestured for her to sit by the stream. Curious, she followed. He crouched beside the water, filling a wooden bowl and handing it to her. She took it carefully, understanding the simple act of kindness it represented. Then he reached into a small pouch and pulled out something, a small carved token shaped from wood. It was smooth, decorated with tiny lines that looked like waves. He held it out to her. Mary looked at the token, unsure at first what to do. Then she realized it was a gift and a symbol of peace. Her heart filled with emotion. She wanted to say thank you, but her words would mean nothing in his language, so she simply placed her hand over her heart and nodded. For a long moment they sat by the stream in silence. The wind moved through the tall grass and the water sparkled under the sun. There were no words between them, only quiet understanding. The next morning everything changed. A group of riders appeared on the horizon, men from another settlement. Mary didn't know who they were, but the camp grew tense. After some time it became clear that they had come to talk, not to fight. There were long discussions, gestures, and exchanges. Mary waited anxiously, her heart heavy with questions. Then the leader approached her again. His expression was calm, but his eyes carried something bittersweet. He pointed toward the riders, then at her, and finally placed his hand over his heart, the same way she had done the night before. She understood instantly. They had come for her. Her breath caught. Part of her wanted to go home to see something familiar again, but another part of her hesitated. She had lived through fear and sorrow here, but she had also found moments of kindness, small but powerful. And now, she was being set free by the same man who could have chosen otherwise. As she prepared to leave, the leader handed her the small carved token once more. She took it carefully, her fingers trembling. Their eyes met. Two souls who had shared silence, pain, and a brief understanding of what it meant to be human beyond all barriers. She whispered softly, "Thank you," knowing he wouldn't understand the words but hoping he would feel their meaning. When she rode away with the others, she turned back once. The leader stood tall by the stream, the wind blowing through his hair, watching until she disappeared over the hill. And though she didn't know what awaited her ahead, she carried the token close to her heart, knowing it would forever remind her that kindness can grow even in the hardest of places. The morning light was soft as Mary rode toward the settlement with the group of men who had come for her. The land around her looked both familiar and strange. The wide plains stretched endlessly, the same as before, but she was no longer the same woman who had once lived on this land. Every mile brought back memories, her home, her husband, the quiet mornings by the fire, but also new ones that had changed her heart forever. Her baby rested in her arms, sleeping peacefully. The little one had grown since those early, frightening days. He was stronger now, his cheeks round, his breathing steady. Looking at him gave her courage. He was proof that life could go on, even when everything else had fallen apart. When they finally reached the edge of the settlement, people gathered, whispering and pointing. Some looked shocked, others relieved. She could hear her name being spoken softly, as if they weren't sure it was really her. One of the older women came forward, tears in her eyes. Mary smiled faintly, though her heart felt heavy. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, yet standing there she didn't feel the simple happiness she expected. The people took her in kindly. They gave her food, water, and a warm place to rest. Everyone wanted to hear her story, but she couldn't bring herself to speak much. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she make them understand that kindness can sometimes come from the most unexpected hands? That night, when everything grew quiet, she sat by the window holding her baby. The moonlight fell across the floor and the world outside looked calm. She thought of the people she had left behind, the camp, the laughter of children, the gentle woman who had shared food with her, and the leader who had shown mercy when he didn't have to. She remembered his steady eyes, the way he had looked at her baby, the carved wooden token he had placed in her hand. She pulled the token from her pocket and looked at it in the moonlight. The small lines carved into the wood shimmered faintly. She ran her fingers over it, feeling the care that had gone into every mark. It wasn't just a piece of wood. It was a reminder that humanity doesn't belong to one place, one color, or one people. It lives in the heart. As days passed, Mary began to rebuild her life. The others saw her as strong, a woman who had survived something unthinkable, but deep inside she carried both pain and peace. She often took her baby outside at sunset, letting him play in the soft grass. When the sky turned orange and gold, she would tell him stories, not of fear, but of courage, understanding, and the kindness she had seen in unexpected eyes. Years went by, and her son grew tall. He was curious and gentle, always asking questions about the world. One evening, when he was old enough to understand, she told him everything about the day her old life ended, about the journey that followed, and about the leader who could have treated her as an enemy, but instead chose compassion. She showed him the carved token, still smooth and bright despite the years. Her son listened quietly, his eyes wide. When she finished, he held the token carefully and said, "He must have been a good man." Mary smiled softly. "Yes," she said, "he was. He taught me something no one else could, that kindness is stronger than fear." From that day on, her son carried that token with him wherever he went. He grew up hearing stories of bravery, not just from one side, but from both. Stories that reminded him that even in dark times, there are people who choose goodness. As Mary grew older, she often sat by the same window where she had once looked out at the moonlight. She would watch the plains stretching far into the distance and think of the people who had once been her captors, but had treated her with a quiet, human respect. In her heart, she no longer saw them as enemies. They were part of her story, the part that had taught her to see the world differently. On her final days, she asked her son to keep the carved token safe. "It belongs to you now," she said gently. "Remember what it means: mercy, understanding, and the power of seeing another person's heart." And long after she was gone, her story lived on. People spoke of the young mother who had once been taken and then shown compassion by a leader who saw her not as a stranger, but as a mother, as a human being. In time, her tale became more than a story of capture and survival. It became a story of connection, of how two hearts from different worlds had met through a single act of kindness. And somewhere, out on the quiet plains where the wind still whispered through the grass, that memory lingered, a reminder that even in the hardest moments, humanity can shine brighter than fear.